My name is Claudette Moreau. I am 67 years old. 11 days after I buried my husband, I sat across a walnut desk in a law office on Collier Street in Barrie and found out what 38 years of marriage looked like on paper. The house on Maple Ridge Drive, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement. The garden Victor spent 20 years coaxing into something presentable, went to my son. The estate lawyer set the assessed value on the table like he was setting down a glass of water. $1.1 million. My son nodded slowly, the way he nods when someone confirms something he already knew. I received a cottage near Parry Sound. 640 square feet on a bay off Georgian Bay, a hand pump well, a floating dock with 2 boards rotted through and a third one threatening, a wood stove that hadn't been lit since 2019. My daughter-in-law had a spiral-bound renovation binder on her lap, and she turned a page when the lawyer read my part. I caught the cover tab when she shifted her bag. It said, "Pays 1." Then my son said the thing I have been thinking about every day since. He pushed the elevator button in the lobby, and without turning around. "The way you'd note that rain was coming," he said. "That road washes out every spring, Mom. If something happened to you up there, nobody'd find you until June." He wasn't wrong about the road. That is the part that took me the longest to understand. Welcome to Fierce Mom Stories. This is where women who were counted out get to count for themselves. If you're just joining us, drop a comment and subscribe, because the reason I'm sitting here telling you any of this didn't arrive until October. I spent 31 years at the Ontario Land Registry office in Barrie. I started as a document examiner in 1988 when the system was still paper-based. Actual ledgers, actual index books, actual hands turning actual pages. I retired in June of 2019, the same week they repainted the parking lot. The work is unglamorous. You sit with title documents. You trace ownership of land backwards through time, sometimes 100 years or more, following every transfer, every charge, every discharge, every easement registered against a parcel. You learn to read a legal description, the way some people read a map and some people read a face. I had one rule, and I said it to every student who came through our office on placement. Read the original document. Don't trust the summary. Summaries are someone else's interpretation, and interpretations miss things. I let my husband's family papers stay with my husband. That was our arrangement. His father's land, his father's records, his business. Victor Moreau ran a heating and plumbing company in Barrie for 28 years. He was 61 when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January of 2026. He died on June 15th. We had been married since October of 1987, and he had a laugh that could fill a parking lot. The will was read on Tuesday, July 8th. The estate lawyer had set out 3 bottles of water and a box of tissues, which told me something about how he expected the afternoon to go. The house on Maple Ridge Drive and its contents went to my son as a specific gift. My son is 40. He works in commercial real estate. His wife, I will call her my daughter-in-law because that is what she is, and precision is the only weapon I have that doesn't jam, is 37. She is an interior designer. Then the estate lawyer read my part. I received the parcel near Parry Sound, legally described as the property at 14 Birchwood Shore Road, Township of Crumbling, along with all mineral, aggregate, and subsurface interests that Victor held in Parry Sound District. My son looked at my daughter-in-law when the lawyer read the word mineral. She looked back at him. Then the residue, a joint savings account with $47,800 split equally. My son folded his hands and waited until we were in the lobby. Then he pushed the elevator button and said the thing about the road washing out and nobody finding me until June. I did not answer him. I stood there thinking about one specific word, mineral. Victor wrote grocery lists in abbreviations. He would not have paid a lawyer to include a clause for something that didn't exist. Let me tell you why my son speaks to me the way he does, because it did not start in that lobby. It started in the spring of 2011. He had found a commercial property in Innisfil, a strip of retail units with a leaky flat roof and 1 vacant anchor space. The bank wanted co-signers on a $340,000 note. He came to our kitchen with a folder and a spreadsheet that was honestly quite good. Victor said yes before my son had finished his second sentence. Victor always said yes to everything our son ever asked. I said no. I had spent 2008 and 2009 watching the Land Registry receive transfer under power of sale filings every single week. People who had done nothing wrong except sign in a good year. I knew what a leveraged deal looks like from underneath. My son sold that property in 2019 for $1.1 million. He has a photograph of the deposit slip on his phone. He shows it at Easter and Christmas. He has a line he uses. My mother made one financial decision in her life, and she got it exactly backwards. He said it at Christmas of 2025. Victor was sitting in his chair and hadn't been eating solid food in 6 weeks. He set down his cup. He looked at our son for a long moment, and then at me, and something moved across his face I couldn't read. I read it in October. On Friday, July 18th, I came home from physiotherapy. I have a knee replacement from 2022. And my key didn't work. My daughter-in-law was in the driveway with a paint deck and a smile. She said they'd had the locks changed because of break-ins on the street. I checked the Barrie Police Service crime summary that evening because 31 years of document work does that to a person. There had been no break-ins on Maple Ridge Drive. She walked me through my own front door. My reading chair, a green wingback I'd had since 1999, was in the garage. On the kitchen island was an invoice from a design showroom in Vaughan. Sofa, 2 club chairs, dining table, pendant lighting. $42,000. Order date, April 28, 2026. Victor died June 15th. I want to be fair to my daughter-in-law because fairness is the only thing I have that doesn't cost anything. Her mother lost a property in a family estate dispute in 2009. A house in Mississauga that went to a stepbrother. Because the will was poorly drafted and nobody had retained a lawyer in time. Her mother couch-surfed for 4 months. My daughter-in-law was 20 years old. She told me this herself, twice in the early years of her marriage. She decided then that she would never be the person standing on someone else's driveway with a story instead of a document. I understood her completely. That did not make her less dangerous. 3 days later, my son sat across from me at the kitchen table and gave me a date. September 1st, the contractors needed the house vacant. My OMERS pension from the Land Registry is $1,380 a month. My CPP is $940. Total, $2,320. There was not a 2-bedroom apartment in Barrie under $2,100. I checked that night, sitting in the garage next to my own reading chair. Then I did what I always do when a problem won't resolve. I went and read the original. I pulled Victor's copy of the will from the folder my son had left on the counter, and I read that clause again word by word. All mineral, aggregate, and subsurface interests Victor held in Parry Sound District, and clipped to the back of the last page, stapled, was something the lawyer hadn't read aloud. A photocopy of a deed dated September 3, 1967. I have a hard-sided suitcase I bought in 2001 for a trip to Charlevoix. Gray, slightly battered along one corner from a luggage carousel at Pearson. I packed it on Saturday, August 1st, 7 changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, the lighted magnifier I'd used for microfilm, which the office let me keep when I retired, a flashlight, no batteries because I told myself I'd buy some on the way through Barrie. I left the reading chair in the garage. I looked at it for 4 seconds and let it go. It is 163 kilometers from my driveway on Maple Ridge Drive to Birchwood Shore Road. Highway 400 north through Barrie, past the Orr Lake turnoff, through the town of Parry Sound, and then east along the bay, where the Canadian Shield comes through the pavement and the radio loses the city stations one by one. I passed the point where the birch trees take over from the maples somewhere around Humphrey. The cottage looked worse than I remembered. Roof soft at the peak. One window with a crack held together by electrical tape. The dock had a section floating free, tethered by a single rusted chain. I took the key off Victor's ring. Brass, worn smooth. The lock stiff the way old locks get when they haven't been turned in a season. The smell came first. lake water and cedar, and the particular cold that old cottages hold even in August. Then the sound. There is a propane wall furnace in the main room, original to 1974, and when it lights it makes 3 clicks before the flame catches. I turned the knob out of habit. 3 clicks. Whump. I stood there, listening to that furnace like it was speaking. Dust on every flat surface in that cottage. The gray felt kind, dense, and undisturbed. Every surface but one. The kitchen table is pine, roughly 6 feet long, with a ring burned into it from a Coleman lantern, set too close for too long. It was clean. Not cleaned last week, cleaned in the spring, around when Victor told me he was driving up alone to close the cottage for the season. He said he was closing it for good. In the center of the table sat a blue tin box, the kind that industrial paint used to come in, square, with a wire handle. It had a strip of masking tape on the lid and in Victor's block print. He used a carpenter's pencil for everything. It said one word, Claude. Next to the box was a plastic freezer bag. Inside, 2 AA batteries and a torn index card for the flashlight. He had known I would come. He had known I would not have batteries. I brought my suitcase in. I made the bed. I ate crackers standing at the counter. I did not open the box until morning. I think I know why. I had been married to whatever was inside it for 38 years and never once been introduced. I opened it Sunday morning with coffee at that pine table. Victor organized things the way he ran a job site. Everything where it belonged, nothing labeled except what needed to be. Taped to the inside of the lid was a card with 2 lines of registry references. Instrument numbers in a shorthand I recognized immediately. The kind of notation that means something to someone who has spent their career at a land registry counter. The first folder held a certified copy of a deed dated September 3, 1967. Grantor. Edmund George Moreau, Victor's father, who died in February of 1991. I met him 3 times, twice before our wedding. He bought farmland in rural Simcoe and Perry Sound counties throughout the 1950s and 1960s. He sold parcels as land values rose. He was known in the Penetanguishene area as a quiet man who held on to things longer than anyone expected. In the granting clause of the 1967 deed, the one that transferred 180 acres of surface to a timber company, there was a line I had read in one form or another 10,000 times during my career. Accepting and reserving thereout unto the grantor his heirs, and assigns all minerals, gravel, sand, limestone, and aggregate materials situate within or under the said lands. He sold the top, he kept the bottom. The second folder held a statutory declaration Victor had registered in 1999 at the Perry Sound Land Registry Office. He declared that he was the sole surviving heir of Edmund George Moreau and that he claimed the mineral and aggregate interests reserved in the 1967 deed and intended to preserve them. He filed it in December of 1999. Under Ontario law, a severed mineral interest that sits unregistered and unused long enough can face legal challenges. The 1967 deed plus 40 years is 2007. He filed 8 years early. That is exactly the kind of thing you do when you know what a clock sounds like. The third folder held a letter from Carver Aggregates Limited of Penetanguishene, dated June of 2004. They had been operating a licensed aggregate pit on adjacent land and wanted to negotiate access to the reserves on Edmund's former parcel. They had traced the mineral reservation. They wanted to purchase the interest outright. Victor had written one word across the top of their letter in pencil. No. The fourth folder was the thick one. 25 letters, all carbon copies, all addressed to the Royalty Accounts Division of Carver Aggregates, all dated in March. The first, March 4, 2001. The last, March 9, 2026. 10 weeks after they told him he had 3 to 5 months. I counted them twice with my coffee going cold. 25 letters. 25 marches. I had made him breakfast on every one of those mornings. I did not yet understand everything. But I have spent my career looking at the shape of a file, and the shape of that file was a man asking the same question once a year for a quarter century, and never once receiving an answer he could bank. I read the 1967 deed the way I would read one for a patron at my counter. Slowly, from the top. Edmund had sold 180 acres of surface and kept everything below it. In the 1980s, when the provincial government began issuing licenses under the Aggregate Resources Act, the land adjacent to Edmund's former parcel was quarried. The gravel was there. The company had eventually traced the reservation. And Victor had been telling them for 25 years that those interests belonged to him. Type the word here in the comments if you're still sitting with me. Subscribe, because what happens in the next 8 weeks is the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. My son called that Sunday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. He was warm. He asked about my knee. He told me about his daughter's hockey. Then he asked his question, and he asked it twice, 10 minutes apart in 2 different approaches. Did you find any of Dad's files up there? He was always keeping things. I said there were quite a few of his things. Right, but like documents, business files, he kept everything. I said I'd let him know what I found. There was a pause. Then his voice shifted to the one he uses at closings. Mom, I just want you to be realistic about that place. That road genuinely washes out in spring. The township doesn't maintain it after November 30th. If you fell in January, nobody would know. You'd be on your own up there. I said I was aware. So be smart about it. You'll be out of there before winter anyway. That's just practical. I picked up a pen and wrote the date on the back of an envelope. He laughed. Sure, Mom, write it down. If you have ever sat in a room while your own child talks about your future, the way they'd talk about a weather forecast, you know how heavy the quiet gets when the call ends. On Tuesday, August 5th, I drove into Parry Sound. The Land Registry office is in the courthouse on James Street. I have worked in land registry my entire career. I know what the counter smells like. The clerk was efficient and polite. She pointed me to a terminal and reminded me that they don't conduct searches for patrons. But everything was on screen, and I was welcome to work. It took me 3 hours and 40 minutes. I pulled the abstract going back to the Crown patent. I found Edmund's 1967 sale. I found Victor's 1999 statutory declaration. Then I looked for what should come next. When Edmund died in 1991, someone should have recorded a transmission application to carry the mineral interest through his estate and into Victor's name. There was nothing. Not a single instrument. In 1991, nobody thought rural Ontario gravel was worth the filing fee. The probate closed without specifically addressing the aggregate reservation. On the Polaris system, the day I was sitting at that terminal, the mineral interests in those 180 acres were still formally in the name of a man who had been dead for 35 years. I made 38 pages of printouts at $1 a page, walked them to my car, sat in the parking lot on James Street, and said it out loud to the steering wheel. Victor had been trying to claim something that was legally his, and nobody could pay him for it because the paper trail stopped at 1991. The next morning, I called the number from the Carver Aggregates letterhead. I reached a man in the Royalty Accounts Division named Arnold Price. He had the steady voice of someone who has explained the same thing to a great many confused people and made peace with it. I gave him the file reference number from one of Victor's letters. I heard typing. He said that interest was held in a trust reserve account. The company holds royalties when they cannot confirm a clear owner of record. Missing documentation, unresolved estate transfers, no signed royalty agreement. He walked me through the list. I asked how much was in the account. He said he couldn't tell me. I wasn't confirmed as owner of record. I sat down on the porch step. He walked me through what I'd need. A registered transmission application, transferring the interest from Edmund's estate into Victor's name. A registered transfer from Victor's estate into mine. Once those were registered in Polaris, my title would be clear. He said 6 to 8 weeks from a complete package to first payment. Then he was quiet for a moment, and his voice came off the script. He said, "Ma'am, are you related to the gentleman who's been writing us every March?" I had to hold the phone away from my face. I said that was my husband. He said, "Oh." And then, after a moment, he was very persistent in a good way. That night, I went through the tin a third time, because that is what you do when a stranger on the phone has just described your dead husband with gentleness. And folded inside the back of Victor's statutory declaration was a third sheet, lined notepaper from the legal pad we kept beside the phone in the kitchen. Dated April 3, 2026, page 1. He wrote plainly, without detours. He wrote that the tin contained everything related to his father's aggregate reservation and every step he had taken since 1999 to claim it. That the interest had never lapsed because active quarrying operations on adjacent licensed lands kept the rights alive. That Carver Aggregates had been paying royalties into a reserve account since 2003, when production began, and had never been able to release the funds because the title chain had a gap at 1991 that nobody had fixed. He wrote that he had tried to fix it himself 3 times. In 2004, he'd been told he needed a court order. In 2012, a title company quoted him a fee he couldn't pay that year. In 2019, he had come to me. I stopped reading when I reached that part. March of 2019. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and asked me how a person goes about fixing a gap in a chain of title when an estate didn't cover a specific asset. I gave him the name of an estate's lawyer in Barrie. I told him the Land Registry on Worsley Street could pull the abstract if he needed to review the instruments. I told him to call me if he got stuck. My mother went into emergency surgery that same week. She was in Sunnybrook for 11 days. She came home and did not get better, and she died in May. He never followed up. I never asked. At the bottom of page 1, in smaller letters, the box is yours to work with. Page 2 is somewhere else. You'll find it. You've always known how to read this kind of thing better than I ever did. I found page 2 on September 6th by noticing that something didn't weigh what it should. Victor had stored the copies of his 25 letters in a manila envelope, and the envelope, when I lifted it for the 3rd time, was heavier than 25 single-page letters ought to be. 2 extra sheets folded inside, stuck to the back seam with old tape. He wrote about the house first. In March of 2023, he had refinanced the Barrie property and used $130,000 from the home equity line to give our son capital for a land assembly deal in Innisfil. The kind of pre-development deal where investors accumulate adjacent residential lots ahead of an official plan amendment. Our son had promised to repay it in 18 months. He had repaid nothing. Victor had been covering the carrying cost out of the business revenue and hadn't told me because he was ashamed he'd said yes without asking me first. He wrote about the will next. In the fall of 2025, he had gone to the law library at the Barrie Courthouse and found the relevant section of Ontario's Succession Law Reform Act. He copied it out longhand. The copy is in the tin, in the same pencil. A specific bequest passes to the beneficiary subject to any mortgage or other encumbrance existing at the date of death without right of exoneration, unless the will expressly directs otherwise. He wrote it in plain language underneath. I gave him the house because he was going to fight for it regardless. I made sure the debt went with it. What I'm giving you is the only thing in this family that isn't leveraged against something else. And then the last part, which I had to put down twice before I could finish it. I didn't say anything in 2019 because I could see you had your mother on your mind and I didn't want to add to it. After that, I decided I'd rather bring you an answer than a question. I ran out of time for the answer, so I'm leaving you the file. I'm sorry it isn't tidier. You always did this part better than me. I did not take his word for any of it. I want to say that clearly, because grief will make a person believe a piece of notebook paper. The Polaris system is accessible online. I confirmed the mortgage registered in Victor's name alone. Principal $310,000, March 2023. I confirmed the equity line, credit limit $130,000, same date. I asked the estate lawyer for the lender payoff statements. As an interested person in the estate, I was entitled to them. The statements arrived in a week. First mortgage balance at date of death, $291,400. Home equity line balance, $430,000. Total encumbrances, $421,400. On a house that appraised in July at $1.1 million, there was $47,800 in the estate account. I sent the estate lawyer one sentence, asking whether the estate would be discharging the encumbrances on the Barry property. His associate quoted me the statute and added one line. Absent express direction to exonerate, the specific devise passes subject to the charges. I read that email standing in the driveway with one bar of signal. My daughter-in-law posted a photo album on September 10th, 46 photographs, before and after. The new sofa, the dining table, the pendant lighting. The album was titled, "Finally Making This House a Home." In the comments, someone from the street asked how Victor's mother was holding up. My daughter-in-law wrote two sentences. She's not herself since we lost him. We're handling all her paperwork now. In a second comment, she added that I had signed off the house years ago and that everything was being handled correctly. I want to be precise about what she meant. Victor had refinanced in 2019. The lender wanted the mortgage in his name alone because I had been retired for several months and had no employment income to document. The title company set a quit-claim deed in front of me at the table with a colored arrow sticker on it. I signed it. It took perhaps 15 seconds. That is what a quit-claim deed is. It is a woman who trusts her husband signing where the sticker is so he can get a better rate. It is not a woman deciding she no longer owns her home. I did not correct my daughter-in-law online. I saved the screenshots with timestamps and named the folder October. On September 2nd, a man came down the Birchwood Shore Road in a black pickup. He was around my age. Canvas jacket. Boots that had never been in mud. He had a business card out before he reached the dock. He introduced himself as a mineral rights consultant based in Barrie. He said he had known the Moreau name on that parcel for a long time and asked whether I was Victor's widow. Then he sat on the dock railing without being invited and made me an offer. $62,000. Cash purchase of the full aggregate and mineral interest. He would handle all registration fees. 7 business day close. I asked how he knew the extent of the interest. He smiled and said this was what he did for a living. I said I needed to think about it. That is when he said the thing he would say twice more that fall. Mrs. Moreau, I'll be honest with you. Nobody pays real money for rights they can't see. And those reserve accounts the operators hold, they don't sit there forever. Unclaimed funds eventually go to the province under the Unclaimed Intangible Property Act. That money's probably already gone. That sentence told me he was lying. Because dormancy under Ontario's unclaimed property legislation requires a period without owner contact. And Victor had been contacting Carver Aggregates every single March since 2001. 25 letters. The account had never been dormant for a single calendar year of its existence. He left his offer letter weighted with a stone from the shore. I went inside and went through the 4th folder until I found what my hands already knew was in there. A letter on company letterhead dated October of 2011. The same consultant firm, different address, same logo. An unsolicited offer to purchase the Moreau aggregate interests, $19,000. Victor had written one word across the top in pencil. No. I called my son that afternoon and made myself sound tired because you learn more that way. I said a mineral rights consultant had come by the cottage with an offer. A pause, about 2 seconds. Then, oh yeah, I know him. He reached out to me a while back. I thought it might help you get sorted, so I mentioned he should come talk to you. I asked how long he'd known the man. Since 2018. They'd crossed paths on a deal in Collingwood. Then my son got impatient, which is his tell. Look, Mom, I told him back in July not to pressure you. I said she's 67, bad knee. She's going to be up there alone on a road that floods in spring. You'll be out of there before winter anyway. I told him to be patient. Then quickly, in the voice of someone who has realized the microphone was on. I didn't mean it like that. I asked which day in July he'd said that to him. He said he didn't remember. I wrote down that he didn't remember. I sat in Annika Sorensen's office on September 9th. She has 2 rooms above a hardware store on James Street in Parry Sound. The whole space smells like cedar from the lumber stored below, which I found calming rather than distracting. She is 44. She let me lay everything on her table without interrupting once, which cost her 15 minutes and bought my complete trust. Then she told me what to do. Victor's father's estate had been administered in 1991 without addressing the aggregate reservation. Ontario's Estates Act allows a court to issue a supplemental order for an asset omitted from an original estate administration. We petition the court. Notice goes to all interested persons. The court issues a transmission order covering the omitted interest, assigning it first through Edmund's estate and then through Victor's estate to me. Once those instruments are registered in Polaris, my title is clean. $2,800 flat, plus court filing fees of $322. I asked whether she would wait for payment until the aggregate company paid me. She said she had enough clients promise payment from funds that never arrived. I understood. I sold Victor's old company van to a plumber in Huntsville for $4,100 and paid her before she filed a single document. She also mentioned, without my asking, that as a surviving spouse, I had grounds to elect against the will under Ontario's Family Law Act and claim a share of the net family property. She said I had a real claim and a real deadline. I told her no, and I want to be clear about why, because it is not sentiment, I said. I don't want half of a house with $421,000 in debt on it. I want Edmund Moreau's name off something. He's been dead 35 years. She wrote that down. Here is what the next 6 weeks actually looked like, because the honest version is more useful than the fast one. September 12th. Annika filed the application to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, Estates Branch, for a transmission order relating to the aggregate interest omitted from the estate of Edmund John Moreau. September 23rd. Notice sent to all interested persons. My son never responded. I don't believe he read it. October 3rd. The court signed the transmission order, 2 pages. It directed that the mineral and aggregate interests reserved in the 1967 deed be transmitted through Edmund's estate and then through Victor's estate into my name. October 7th. I stood at the Polaris counter in Parry Sound, registered the transmission application and the transfer of the interest into my name, and paid $66.50 in registration fees. The clerk stamped the instrument numbers and handed me the registered copies. I went and sat in the car for a while. 1967, 1991, 1999, 2001 through 2026. 35 years of a family owning something they couldn't prove. Closed with a rubber stamp and $66.50. I couriered the full packet to Carver Aggregates that same afternoon. Registered transmission, transfer, signed royalty agreement, everything they had asked for. Then I drove back to the cottage and waited. Odette Bergeron called on the morning of Friday, October 24th. She was the royalty accounts manager, and she had the voice of someone who has delivered both good and bad news enough times to treat neither carelessly. She said their legal team had cleared the title. She said my name was now on the account as owner of record. Then she read me the reserve balance. $864,400. I asked her to say it again. $863,422, with the current month's royalty payment not yet posted. Going forward, based on the last 12 months of production, the monthly royalty averaged approximately $2,800. I asked about the dormancy concern, whether the funds might have been transferred to the province. She said, "No, ma'am, this account was never dormant. The last owner correspondence on file is dated March 9th of this year." March 9th, 2026, 10 weeks after diagnosis. When I hung up, I did something I'd been putting off since the first night I arrived. I took the hard-sided suitcase from beside the cottage door. It had been standing there for 61 days, like I'd been in a motel deciding whether to stay, and I put it in the closet and shut the door. Then Odette said one more thing, and she said she was only telling me because I was now the owner of record, and it was documented in the file. There was a call log from July 10th, a call to their investor relations line. The caller identified himself as the son of the registered interest holder and asked 2 questions. First, what happens to suspended royalties when the record owner of a mineral interest passes away? Second, how does a family member get added as an authorized contact on a royalty account? The answer given was that royalties follow the mineral title through the estate of the deceased, and that contact authorization requires documentation from the registered owner. The will was read July 8th. My son called them July 10th. 2 days. I took an envelope from the kitchen table and wrote on the back of it in pen, the way you write something you're going to need to say out loud later. July 10, Investor Relations, 2 days after the will was read. He hadn't said, "You'll be out of there before winter anyway," because he was impatient with me in a hallway. He had said it to a mineral rights consultant in July as part of a business conversation about a timeline on an asset. It was never careless. It was a projection. 2 things arrived on Wednesday, October 29th. The first was a written valuation from a mineral asset consulting firm in Sudbury that I had contacted. Not to sell, but to get an independent number from someone with nothing to gain from telling me one thing or another. Their estimate of the fair market value of the Moreau aggregate interest, based on 3 years of production data and remaining licensed reserves, was between $310,000 and $380,000. The consultant from Barrie had opened at $62,000. He'd come back at $91,000. Under the clause on page 3 of his contract, about all accrued, suspended, and unpaid proceeds attributable to the interest conveyed. Either of those numbers would have purchased the $863,400 in reserve along with everything that came after it. The second thing was a group text. My son's address in Barrie, Sunday the 2nd, open house and early housewarming, a caterer, a photographer from a regional home and lifestyle magazine. At the end, "Mom, you should come. Bring something if you want." I baked a rhubarb crumble on Saturday in an oven that runs about 50 degrees hot once I've calibrated it properly. Sunday morning, I loaded the car, the crumble in a covered dish on the back seat, the blue tin box in the trunk with a dish towel folded over the lid. I drove 163 kilometers south, the same road the other direction. The first time I'd made that drive, I hadn't known what I was carrying. There were 31 people in my kitchen. I counted because counting keeps my hands still when my hands want to shake. The consultant was near the patio door with a glass of wine. He saw me and raised it slightly. My son brought me in with a hand between my shoulder blades and introduced me to the room. Everybody, my mom, she's been up at the lake all fall, living the quiet life. People smiled the way they do. I set the crumble on the counter. My daughter-in-law was 4 feet away, her back to me, talking to 2 women from the neighborhood. "She's not herself since we lost Victor. We're looking after all her paperwork now." One of the women said something sympathetic. My daughter-in-law turned around with a serving spoon in her hand and saw me standing there. For 3 full seconds, her face was not her face. It was the face of a 20-year-old watching her mother sort through what could fit in a car, outside a house that was no longer hers. Then it closed back, smooth as a drawer shutting. "Mom," she said, "kitchen's just behind you." I set the crumble down. Then I went back out to the car and came in with the blue tin. I set it on the island. The granite island Victor had chosen in 2007 because he liked the fossils pressed into the stone along one edge. I asked my son for a moment. He said not now and turned back to his guest. I said it again at exactly the same volume. The room does what rooms do when a woman doesn't raise her voice. It goes quiet in a radius that keeps widening. I opened the tin. I laid 4 documents side by side on the granite. I said, "On October 3rd, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, Estates Branch, issued a transmission order for mineral and aggregate interests omitted from Edmund Moreau's estate in 1991. Those interests are registered in my name in Polaris. 180 acres of aggregate-bearing land in Parry Sound District, in 3 active production areas. I put down the royalty statement from Carver Aggregates. There is $863,400 in a reserve account in my name. It releases next week. Going forward, royalties average $2,800 a month. No one spoke. The photographer lowered his camera. I turned toward the patio door. You told me twice that nobody pays real money for rights they can't see. You made that offer twice. I'd like to read the relevant clause from your contract. I read paragraph 3, second sentence, out loud, all of it. Then I said, your first offer was $62,000. Your second was $91,000. Both of those numbers, under this clause, would have purchased the $863,400 sitting in that reserve account. He set his wine glass on the shelf and walked out through my dining room without his coat. My son hit the island with the flat of his hand. The glasses jumped. He said his father had no right to any of this. He said it twice, and the second time his voice cracked. I did not raise mine. There are 3 more things, I said, and then I'll go. I laid down the remaining documents. This is the mortgage registered on this house in Victor's name in March of 2023. Balance at date of death, $291,400. This is the home equity line registered the same day. Credit limit $130,000. He drew the full amount and transferred it to you for the Innisfil Land Assembly. You have made no repayments. Someone, near the window, said something very quietly. That is $421,400 in charges on a house that appraised at $1.1 million in July. There is $47,800 in the estate account. I put down the last sheet. It was the relevant section of Ontario's Succession Law Reform Act, the clause about specific bequests passing subject to existing charges, without right of exoneration. The estate does not discharge those encumbrances for you. The clause about paying just debts doesn't change it. The $47,800 is not yours, and it wouldn't cover 3 months of carrying costs. This house costs you approximately $3,400 a month to hold, mortgage payments, interest on the equity line, property tax, insurance, every month, starting now. My son stared at the granite slab with the fossils in it. Then I said the last part in the same voice I had used for 31 years, telling people at the registry counter which terminal to use. You told me I'd be out of there before winter. On July 10th, 2 days after the will was read, you called Carver Aggregates and asked what happens to suspended royalties when the registered owner of the interest passes away. I know the date. I know the time. I picked up the tin. I never thought it was careless. I thought it was a plan. Here is what happened after, measured the only way I've ever trusted, in documents and dates. My son listed the house on Maple Ridge Drive on November 17th at $1,069,000. That is $31,000 below the July appraisal in a November market, with $421,400 in charges registered against it. That is not a price. That is a flare. As of the day I'm telling you this, there have been 2 showings and no offers. My daughter-in-law returned $19,000 worth of furnishings to the showroom in Vaughan. The restocking fee was 15%. She absorbed it. The consultant from Barrie never called again. Annika sent a letter on October 30th requesting that any further contact come through her office. He signed the registered return. That was the last of him. His contract clause, she told me, was not illegal. It was simply the reason you read past page 1. The reserve account released on October 31st. $863,400 in 2010 deposited to a credit union account in Parry Sound. It arrives entirely within 1 tax year, which means a significant federal and Ontario provincial tax exposure. I moved $210,000 into a separate account and have not touched it. My son's estate lawyer wrote to ask whether the estate account could be used to pay down the mortgage before distribution. He received the same statute I had read aloud in the kitchen. My son sent me a text on November 28th, 3 paragraphs. The first 2 were about how difficult the year had been. I answered with 1 sentence, "Call Annika Sorensen. She has my number." I signed a road maintenance contract for Birchwood Shore Road on November 12th, $780 for the season, paid up front, to a man named Dwight with a tractor and a reliable schedule. That is what it costs to make my son's arithmetic wrong. $780. The furnace still clicks 3 times before it lights. New valve, same 3 clicks. I count them out loud now without noticing. 1, 2, 3, and then the flame. The blue tin sits on the kitchen windowsill. Lid open. I keep receipts in it, road contract, propane, the registered copies of the Polaris instruments, because I am not going to be the next person in this family who cannot prove what she owns. The suitcase is in the closet. I am not planning to need it. I have a roofer coming in May. Quoted $28,000, and I've budgeted for a new dock section and the bathroom window that hasn't sealed since 2018. This is still an ugly little cottage. It is mine. There is not a single income registered against it anywhere in Polaris. I sent my son 1 letter, and the last line took 3 drafts to get right. I wrote that I'm not carrying anger because anger is weight, and I have carried enough this year. I wrote that there will be no loans, no guarantees, and no advances. I wrote that all communication about his father's estate goes through Annika Sorensen's office. And then the last line, written twice before I got it right. The door is open the day you can tell me, when you decided I was worth more to you gone. Until then, we're fine at a distance. We had our first real snow on December 4th. Dwight came through at 6:30 in the morning, right on schedule, and the road was clear by 7:30. I made coffee and took it out to the dock in Victor's old barn coat, and I read the first letter again. March 4th, 2001. 2 paragraphs. He misspelled the word aggregate in the second one. He never received a single dollar of it. But he got the last word, and he got it through me, which I think is exactly what he was hoping for. Here is what I would tell you. If you are the one your family talks around, they will always price you by what they can see. The house, the address, the pension deposit. And if you let them do it long enough, you will start to price yourself the same way. Your job is to go read the original. If this story made you think of a document you've never opened, a deed, a will, an old policy tucked in your mother's filing cabinet, go open it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.